Madam President, I would say to my friend from Virginia, we both serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and of course we've both been very intimately involved in the investigation about Russian activities up to and including the 2016 election. But I would like to just point out the hypocrisy of our colleagues across the aisle who have refused to take up any legislation whatsoever, like the Senate Bill 1 that's on the floor, that would take extraordinarily positive measures to protect our most important allies in the Middle East, including Israel and Jordan. They've filibustered that bill and said, well, we're not going to take up any legislation until the government is back open, all 100% of it. So for the past 2 weeks, the minority leader has paralyzed the work of the Senate, saying that they would block the Senate from considering any legislation unrelated to government funding. A number of our colleagues have said, for example, the junior senator from Virginia, he said the Senate should vote on nothing and nothing else until we vote to reopen the government, period. Senator Merkley said the Senate schedule cannot be business as usual if we shut down a quarter of the government and just leave it shut down. Senator Booker said Senate Democrats should block consideration of all unrelated bills. All this comes as a result of the fact that the impetus is on the Democrats to come forward and negotiate a resolution of the shutdown in good faith. But to this point, the Speaker, Ms. Pelosi, and the Minority Leader, Senator Schumer, have simply refused to negotiate with the President. I was with the President down in Texas, down along the border on Thursday. He's willing to negotiate. We know that we've had broad bipartisan support for the Secure Fence Act, for example, in 2006, authorizing up to 800 miles of fencing on the southern border. The Democratic leader voted for that. So did Barack Obama. So did Hillary Clinton. Later in 2014, all Democrats voted for $40 billion in border security, including barriers, fencing, tactical infrastructure along the border. Now they're saying, as the Speaker has said, that somehow this is immoral. Well, this is hypocrisy at its worst. Madam President, on another matter, today the Senate Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on the nomination of William Barr to be Attorney General of the United States. Mr. Barr is uniquely qualified for this position, in large part because he held that job before. Matter of fact, 27 years ago, he was nominated by George Herbert Walker Bush to be Attorney General of the United States. He was confirmed by a unanimous voice vote in the Senate. It received little fanfare at the time because it wasn't particularly controversial. Nothing like the contentious partisan confirmation battles we've seen the last 2 years. There wasn't an attempt, at least so far, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed, to assassinate Mr. Barr's character or to try to decipher the notes in his high school yearbook, like we saw in the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. Instead, so far, and to the committee's credit, we focused on his qualifications, and he's clearly smart and articulate and able. He has a clear understanding of what the role of the Attorney General is, and more importantly, what it is not. An Attorney General should not be a politician. Matter of fact, an Attorney General has the very difficult job of trying to balance his responsibilities as the chief law enforcement officer in the country, enforcing the rule of law, along with the fact that he is a political appointee of the President. To me, that's one of the most difficult positions in the cabinet to hold. But Mr. Barr has done it before, and I think he can do it again. He, of course, has great institutional knowledge about the Department of Justice, and he's held, in addition to Attorney General, he's held the job as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel and then Deputy Attorney General before he was promoted to the top job. Back in 1992, when Mr. Barr was confirmed, then Chairman of the Senate Judiciary, Joe Biden, President Obama's vice president, said that he would be a fine Attorney General. This morning, I heard Mr. Barr discuss the qualities that undoubtedly led senators on both sides of the aisle to support his confirmation. He spoke of the importance of acting with professionalism and integrity. Matter of fact, he said at 68 years old, after he's basically had decided to semi-retire, only to answer the call by the president to return to public service, he said, "I am completely independent. I'll make the hard decisions. I'll make the right decisions. I'll help restore the reputation of the Department of Justice and the FBI to an apolitical, a non-political department," which is exactly what we need. He wants to make sure that the character and reputation of the Department of Justice is enhanced and restored and then maintained, and that it can withstand even the most trying political times, including those in which we presently live. And of serving with independence, he said, providing no promises or assurances to anyone or anything other than to faithfully execute and administer the laws of the United States of America. It's clear to me he maintains the same views he did back 27 years ago. And I share his view that the Department of Justice should function outside of the highly politicized times that we live in. And that's that the fair and impartial administration of justice is the highest obligation and duty of this position. So I believe Mr. Barr will be an outstanding nominee, and then once confirmed will be an outstanding Attorney General, and I look forward to voting yes on his nomination. Madam President, on the matter of the government shutdown, the 25% of the government which is presently not funded, last week I traveled with the President along with my colleague Senator Cruz to the Rio Grande Valley to McAllen, Texas. After the President held his roundtable where he saw heroin, methamphetamine, and weapons, and heard about the human trafficking, including sex slavery for children and for girls and women, after that presentation, after the President left, Senator Cruz and I sat down with a number of our constituents, county judges, mayors, law enforcement officers, as well as the folks from Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. They understand the border better than anybody because they live there. They are deeply concerned about the posturing in Washington and how the political arguments seem to overcome logic and listening to the experts when it comes to border security. And I was glad for them to confirm once again what they previously told me, that what we need to do to strengthen those border communities and to keep our country safe while keeping legitimate trade and commerce flowing across the border. During our discussion, Scott Luck, Deputy Chief of the Border Patrol, talked about the positive impact of physical barriers and what positive impact they have at targeted locations along the southern border. He said the physical barrier has worked every place I've seen. I've been in places where they did not have it. They put it in and it worked. He mentioned Douglas, Arizona as one of those. Said there were more people coming into the country there than in any other place in the United States. I was there. It stopped. It stopped in California. It stopped in Yuma. It stopped in El Paso. It will stop wherever we put it. Despite what our colleagues across the aisle are saying, physical barriers at the border can be effective when coupled with technology and personnel. It doesn't do you much good to have a physical barrier that somebody can go over or around or through, and you don't have a Border Patrol agent there to detain them. And actually, the physical border is the last place you're going to stop people trying to illegally enter into the United States, together with the narcotics and the human trafficking. But it's important to have those tools available to the Border Patrol, and that's what Chief Deputy Luck was stressing. He made the common sense observation that physical barriers alone are not the solution for the entire border. A holistic border security approach also requires technology and personnel. When we were discussing the need for building physical barriers in strategic locations, my friend, Cameron County Judge Eddie Trevino, said something to Border Patrol Council President Brandon Judd that I think encapsulates the whole debate. He was talking to the Border Patrol and CBP. He said, if you tell us where you need it, I think we're all on board. If politicians tell us where we need it, I think that's where we have our concern. In other words, what Judge Trevino is saying, let's listen to the experts, the people who know how to use the right combination of technology, tactical infrastructure, and personnel at each given place along the border, because it makes no sense to try to treat this like a one-size-fits-all, because anybody who's ever been to the border between the United States and Mexico knows the geography and topography vary tremendously from place to place. So let's not try to dictate from Washington, D.C. where every dollar goes, and in so doing try to micromanage the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection and the Department of Homeland Security. Let's leave that to the experts, the men and women who work to protect and secure our border every day. What we continue to hear and what I continue to advocate is for a layered approach. Barriers, where they're appropriate, technology, and personnel. That's exactly what we've been talking about. That's what we voted for in 2006 with the Secure Border Fence Act that Democrats supported along with Republicans. It's what law enforcement officers tell us they need to operate optimally. And unfortunately, it's what Democrats are now refusing to negotiate and provide. But when looking at the border, it's not just about physical security we need to be concerned. We need to be concerned about our economic security as well. So during our discussions last week with local stakeholders, we also focused on the importance of facilitating legitimate trade and travel at our ports of entry. I was shocked by this figure, but the Customs and Border Protection officer there, Mr. Higgerson, mentioned that trade from Texas ports alone are valued at $300 billion per year. For the state of Texas and border communities in particular, these ports fuel our economy, and we need to provide additional funding to ensure efficient movement across the border. And one thing we all agree on is that most of the high-end drugs, the heroin, the methamphetamine, and the fentanyl come through the ports of entry. So let's modernize those. Let's provide the technology needed in order to stop the flow of that poison into the United States. But trade, legitimate trade and commerce, is the lifeblood not only of our border region and my state, it's also the lifeblood of our nation's economy. 5 million Americans their jobs depend on binational trade with Mexico alone. Along with a number of colleagues from Texas, we are sending a bipartisan letter to President Trump thanking him for his continued work to secure our southern border. His advocacy for that layered approach, as well as for port of entry improvements, is vital to my state. In that letter, we also address recent rumors to the effect that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer funds might be used for border security purposes, and I've urged the President not to take that route. While I'll continue to advocate for additional border security, I believe those funds were intended to support disaster relief and should be used for that purpose. We need both border security and to lend a helping hand to those who are still recovering from natural disasters. We don't have to rob from Peter to pay Paul. We need to do both. I'm grateful for the support shown by the President to the people of Texas, both in the days following Hurricane Harvey's landfall and in the nearly year and a half since. And I hope he'll continue to work with all of my Texas colleagues and me as we rebuild our communities impacted by Hurricane Harvey and as we work together to secure our border. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Would the Senator yield for a moment?
I will.
I want to thank him for his comments. Senator Cornyn lives down on the border, at least his state's on the border, and he's well familiar with that part of the world. As it turned out, as a former chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, I've had a chance to visit the borders in your state and other states along the Mexican border. Not that long ago, there were a whole lot of Mexicans coming into the United States, as you know, and not so many Mexicans going back into Mexico. In the year 2000, when border illegal immigration peaked, huge numbers of Mexicans coming in. Today, not so much. As you know, they're coming in from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. And we can I'm a huge advocate of border security. I think fencing makes sense in a lot of places. We have hundreds of miles of fencing, and in a lot of places, roads alongside fences make sense. And we have very sophisticated surveillance equipment that can look from different platforms, drones, fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, stationary towers, mobile towers, can look down 20, 25 miles into Mexico and pick up people coming from the south. Motion detectors make sense, tunnel detectors make sense. There's a lot of stuff that makes sense. And I'm all for investing there, and I think Democrats and Republicans can find common ground there, and I think we have. If you look at the appropriations bills that we passed, we actually fund that kind of stuff. And it's not just a Democrat idea, it's not just a Republican idea. Those are good ideas. And a lot of them come from our Border Patrol personnel, as you know. But we could do all that and more on the southern border with Mexico. But if people in Honduras and Guatemala and Salvador continue to live lives of misery, we're complicit in because of our addiction to drugs, they're going to still want to come up here. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and to also address through Alliance for Prosperity, which is really a modern-day Plan Colombia, to provide a little bit of hope and opportunity so they'll feel less compelled to come to this country to have a better life. Thank you.
Madam President, if I can just respond to my friend, the senator from Delaware. He speaks correctly and accurately about, I think, some of the symptoms and some of the cures that we need to put in place to deal with this extraordinary complex problem. And would love to continue to work with him on coming up with something, we may want to call it not Plan Mexico, but Plan Americas, because really what we have to deal with is a regional challenge. And he's exactly right. Most of the illegal immigration now is coming from Central America, and because of gaps in our immigration and human trafficking laws, it encourages unaccompanied children and family units to come up to the border because they can essentially get placed in the United States while they wait for their asylum claim to be determined by a court. And there's a backlog of 700,000 or 800,000 asylum claims. In other words, the criminal organizations that move people for money into the United States, they've cracked the code, and they've figured out how to be successful in placing people in the United States. But unfortunately, it also helps enrich those organizations which moved the poison from south of the border into the United States that contributed to the deaths of some 70,000 Americans last year alone. And I'm thinking particularly about the fentanyl coming from China to Mexico and up across the border, along with the heroin. 90% of it comes from Mexico that's consumed in the United States. And I agree, it's the demand here in the United States that enriches the cartels, but they're more or less commodity agnostic. In other words, they'll do anything that makes them money, these criminal organizations. And we need to have people sit down and work together, and I pledge to work with my colleague to try to do that. But we can't get a solution as long as the Speaker of the House calls physical infrastructure or barriers immoral. That's kind of a non-starter to a conversation that we need to have to try to negotiate our way out of this shutdown. So I would welcome working with my friend.